Hello, insane children, and welcome to yet another crowd design session. This is episode number 19, and today we're going to be discussing enemies, and that includes the infamous Dr. Bumby. This is going to cover the section on the Asylum Wiki, which is the upper level section called characters, and inside of characters, Martin, stop that. Area Visual, stop that.
What am I doing?
Inside of the section called characters, we have protagonists and enemies, and so we're going to cover that section, and we're also going to go through some of the community ideas for enemies under the community's ideas and sections down at the section called enemies. Anyway, enemies. Have I said enemies enough? If you do have anything you'd like to add to the discussion today, there is the microphone emoticon, and so you can put that into the chat. I think someone's going to do an example of that. I would also like to ask that if you have a keyboard that doubles as a machine gun, that you please mute your microphone so that we don't all have to listen to the clicking machine gun business. That includes you, Martin, and you, Magus. All right. So with that, let's see if our mods have got anything else they want to add.
I'm just holding back.
I'm just going to unload my keyboard.
Okay. So why don't we go ahead and get started? First up is going to be the topic of Dr. Bumby, which we have actually talked about quite a bit. He's also known as the doll maker for those of you who played Alice Madness Returns. And of course, it is revealed at the end of Alice Madness Returns, spoiler alert, that he is the ultimate bad guy, the one who not only burned down the Liddell family house, but also apparently messed about with Alice's older sister and did a lot of other horrible things involving children and being inappropriate. So, of course, there's a lot of strong emotions surrounding Bumby as a character, all perfectly understandable. And in recent times, we have actually been working on the concept of placing him in Alice Asylum. And of course, keeping in mind that Alice Asylum is a prequel, that means it happens prior to the events of AMA or AMR. It happens just after the fire. We're suggesting that 13-year-old Alice is not aware of Bumby's involvement with the fire, nor is she really conscious of just how evil this guy is, which means that he can play a role in Asylum. I think we've suggested here that he's going to be the shopkeeper in a doll shop, and of course that connects later to what we find he is a doll maker. But in that shop, he's going to be the person who is perhaps doing modifications to Alice's weapons, or he may be presenting her with or refilling some of her weapons. He may be doing some work on her dresses. But basically, he's going to kind of play a role of tailor, toy maker, weapon modifier. Is there a movie by that name? So there has been a bit of, I think, back and forth, the conversation. We have an image here on screen that shows him in what we've referred to as sort of the spider hiding hole, in an effort to kind of obscure his face. And we would hear his voice. And of course, he has the signature puppet hands that he uses to operate around the shop. I think there's been some concerns about how he's presented in the story. Is there anybody here who wants to kind of voice those before I make an attempt to answer? I know a few of the people in the chat today are among the ones who are a bit concerned about how we're presenting him.
I like what Ancient do the dictator thing.
Is that in reference to our democratic dictatorship?
I think so, but
All right.
Yeah.
The People's Republic of America McGee's game design sessions, yes.
There you go. And yeah, Octo Chicken got it, the Tinker Tailor doll maker reference. It was a movie.
And Seafoam.
Well, Asteria, would you mind voicing I guess, the concern, and then I could maybe recap the little conversation that we had
Oh
prior
yeah,
to the.
So we can
the
play
story.
devil's advocate, huh?
yeah. That.
Yes, please be devil's advocate, so I can then talk about devil's advocate.
So, anyways, a couple people, including myself, they just think that the way he's presented currently, or the way you might be going for, say, like the spider legs and all that, kind of makes him like the hashtag I am obvious villain. But I think it's just people, from what I've read, is they want him just a little more subtle on that. So of course he's gonna be creepy and whatever, but not as much as you're giving it out now in those drawings.
Right. Yeah. So actually, before this session started, I did have a little side chat with some of our mods on this topic, and I want to be really careful in making sure that we address everyone's concerns, because he's obviously a really important character, and the emotional energy that he generates, is not something that we want to just sort of lightly brush aside. And so I've been watching the reactions on Patreon, and then also we've posted up on Facebook, like the Alice Madness Returns page, and we've posted up on Instagram, and we've shown people the sort of iterations and the variations and the way that the thinking on this character has evolved. And the image that we have on screen now, the one Omri did most recently, seems to be the one that's most widely accepted, just in terms of presentation, art style, kind of like level of creepiness, and sort of communicating to us who know who he is, that is Bumby, without just straight up showing his face, which a lot of people don't want to see his face, and I can understand why. Uh, but like Asteria just said, one of the concerns is, oh, hey, Captain Obvious, it's a bad guy, and that's fair enough. But I think what we want to try to do is I'd like to present, the argument for why he's obviously a bad guy and why Alice might understand that. And that did come up in conversation this morning, and it was in reference to the movie The Devil's Advocate, in which Keanu Reeves goes to work for a law firm and knows that the guy that he's going to work for is probably evil, but hey, I'm going to get ahead in life and it's going to be okay. And then lo and behold, whoops, I'm actually working for like the literal Satan. So that sort of trope does exist in storytelling, the idea that, I don't feel very comfortable about working with this person, but I sort of need to get my weapons upgraded. So I'm going to go do it anyway. And that is kind of what we're proposing here, is that I don't think it makes much sense for us to try to hide the fact that Bumby is a bad guy, because we already all know that. And we already are going to go into the game, and the first time we see anybody or anything that kind of hints that like it might be Bumby, we're just going to be like, it's the devil, it's the devil. There's going to be very little point in trying to dress him up as anything else. So I suggest that we don't. I suggest that we do make him fairly obviously dark, and that there's something a little off there, and that Alice also recognizes that, hey, wait a second, you're kind of creepy. I don't really like this, but I've got to go into your lair in order to get stuff done on my equipment. And then here's the thing: we may decide, as we're getting towards the end of the storytelling here, that there's a way that Alice comes to realize not the full implications of just how evil he is, but enough that let's say she burns his shop down, or she finds some other way to exile him until he reappears again in Alice Madness Returns. I don't want him to be like a major point, like a major bad guy in this game, but certainly having these kind of nods to what we know of who he is should be, I think, fun and interesting. So that's the basic concept. So I'd like to get some feedback, especially from those of you, that are here, that have expressed concern about this. Let's get some feedback from you on that.
I like Nabi Yang's suggestion in the chat that if it's just like some normal guy, smooth voice, but you never see his face. Like, I don't know if like it's the camera, every time it's about to see him, like maybe he stood behind a lamp or something, and you just never get to see him, or just some subtle tricks like that.
Actually, that
Right.
reminds me of the magicians with the beast, where you never see the person's face. It's covered in moss the entire time, and that could be played with very elegantly.
Well, there's a few
Right.
things in modern like pop culture, isn't there, where you'd never see someone's face. Like, what was that guy? What was the Tim Allen show where his neighbor was always behind the fence?
Oh,
Home Improvement,
that's the one.
or in Spaced, you never saw Marsha's daughter. She was always just running past or something. So there's a character there that you never see them.
Well, I mean, we do have him like literally hidden in a dark hole here. The only thing that you see is the glasses. You know how, you know, to what extreme we take this, but certainly the current thinking is that you wouldn't see him. You would never see his face. We would have him hidden in shadows somehow. So, you know, the illustration that we have on screen for today's discussion, as we've said many times in the past, you know, by the time we actually get to the building of this kind of stuff in the game, there's likely to be changes and filtering. It's sort of Chinese whispers, right? Our level designers, our animators, our artists will end up with this in hand, and as they try to implement it in game, they'll find that there are issues that are either technical or that are related to storytelling that prevent the exact thing we see on screen here from being represented in the game. So it could be, like you said, somehow she's viewing him from a lower perspective, below the counter. Uh, I mean, I can imagine a lot of technical issues with that, just in terms of positioning the camera so that we can see products and we can see his hands. But hey, why don't we leave it for when we're actually building the level? I think the main part of what we have in this image, though, is something we've all agreed on, which is we're not going to see his face. We would only see something like these puppet hands or maybe his real hands. And I'd say go for the puppet hands just because they're more magical, they're more Wonderlandy, and of course they're more linked ultimately to what we see in Madness Returns. So I'm just looking through the comments here really quickly. There's a comment from Eva Marie. She says, so I personally think it would be best if Bumby isn't creepy in this game, because like you have mentioned before, Alice doesn't know that he is a creep yet, but having him give her little stares or say slightly off things, which makes longtime fans feel creeped out, but not creepy enough to alert the new players. That is one direction we could go with this, and I think we have thought about that a bit. My kind of feeling on that is that it's Wonderland, and I kind of want to see a twist and a magical interpretation on stuff. So to suggest that he's not creepy also would kind of suggest that he's not very fantastic. And I like the idea of everybody being a little bit fantastic. I think that the challenge, Eva Marie, in the way we present him, even in this sort of face hiding, in the shadows and the hands, he, in that representation, we're going to want to write him and voice him in a way that he's trying not to be creepy, despite the fact that he clearly, obviously is. And I think that push-pull between he looks creepy, but we are invited into his shop and we have to interact with him. And he's sort of, through his communication with us, he's sort of apologizing for his creepy nature. He's trying to make us feel better about it. That would throw me off quite a bit more than somebody who's, slick and clean and well presented, and they're trying to convince me that there's nothing to be afraid of, or that they're normal. I feel, at least in Wonderland, I'd feel a little bit more put off by that. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm just going through some more comments here. I like, Seafoam said something that I think is kind of cute, is that, maybe at the end Alice finds doll versions of her family members, and that freaks her out. It sort of pushes her over the line, and then that's what causes her to do whatever it is. Seafoam says burn his place to the ground. I don't know that that's ultimately where that's going to end up. I'm just using that as an example of the final, the period put at the end of the sentence with regards to Alice's relationship with him in this in Asylum. We will need to figure that out at some point. Eva Marie says, "Isn't burning the shop down a little too obvious?" Yeah, I mean, again, let's kind of cross that bridge when we get to it. I don't know exactly how that's going to end just yet. Stereo Visual jokingly suggested earlier that like she pushes him in front of a train again.
Yeah.
See, this was I'm just going back in time to find one of the first times we had an image of Bumby created and posted that. So I always like this kind of aspect. I really think that he should just be Bumby.
Yeah.
Make him sweet, make him saccharine, make him something that is there because he groomed her. I mean, it's creepy. He was creeping out Alice's sister. He was creeping out on him. He's not a good guy, but he tries to play it up to her. So that's my take on it.
Yeah. For
So
my original
my
one.
sense is that her mind doesn't have a clear enough picture of him that it would form up anything about him. It doesn't happen until later that she's older. He's pulled her out of the asylum. He's obviously doing these daily, psychology sessions with her, the couch sessions with her. And at that point, she's, as an adult, gets a very clear picture of his face and his voice, and all of this is starting to come out. But I think it's important to remember that 13-year-old Alice probably doesn't have much of a view of who he is, what his face looks like, what his relationship was to the family. I don't feel like that information is there. And I think that's one of the reasons why the information wasn't presented. We could suggest why it wasn't presented at all in AMA. Was, again, at that point in her timeline, she hadn't had a lot of face-to-face with him. So it's one of the reasons why I want to be careful that if we were to show him full body as normal Dr. Bumby, as was seen in AMR, I would have to ask the question, well, where was he in AMA? And why wasn't there a full body representation or something about him there as well? But even putting that aside, I remember we had some conversation about this, and someone had said that the form of him that 13-year-old Alice would have known would have still been a much younger Bumby who was perhaps still in school. Is that ring a bell for anybody?
Greg, where are you? Come here. Speak. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, so... are we waiting for Greg to speak?
I don't know if he's going to actually use his mic. I just saw his name pop up in the chat.
Okay. But I am kind of curious, if we... I mean, do we want to spend a lot more time on the Bumby thing? I understand he's an important character, but I kind of feel like there's enough of a sketch of an idea for him. There's a toy shop. He's the one running it. Are we agreed on that? It sounds like a yes. I mean, is there anybody that feels like, no, he shouldn't be in the game at all, or that, hey, he shouldn't be running the toy shop at all? And if he is running the toy shop and we're there, it sounds like we're pretty agreed that, or at least I think there's some agreement that we're not going to really see his face. That seems to have come across quite a few times, that we kind of smooth over that aspect of him.
I think we're pretty much all in agreement there.
Right.
Greg said, I feel like Bumby in this game is 15 minutes of shopkeeper that we interact with, and he should be off-puttingly creepy in a way that seems too nice.
Yeah, I agree. It should be that I keep going back to saccharine. It's just he should be there. He's not the main focal point. He just leaves that uck taste in your mouth, like you've been on It's a Small World.
Okay. Well, how about this? I don't know how to get that across in the concept art right now, because we have concept art that shows him as just the shopkeeper, like a human form standing behind the counter, just being Bumby with his glasses on. That has been, sort of posited. That's been put out there. And we also have sort of spider hole Bumby where we don't see his face. That's out there. My recommendation would be that we build a page for Bumby, and that the page, makes it clear that he runs the shop, and we try to capture a couple of the high points that we've discussed here, and try to agree on a couple of these things. So, for instance, do we agree that young Alice at 13 years of age just doesn't really have a very clear picture of Bumby, who he is, what he's about? It's a sort of subconscious, creepy thing, but that's all there is to it. If we can agree on that, then let's record that on the page. And let's record a couple of these other major features that we agree on, and then just leave it at that. And when it comes time to build out this shop, we can revisit this. And again, like I said, there may be some aspects that are sort of technical constraints that make us decide on a way to present this. There may be more things that we come up with between now and when we start to build his shop, where perhaps a month or two from now we've decided, hey, this guy's going to play a really important role. This really critical thing's going to happen, but we're just not aware of that just yet.
Ancient Child wanted noted that she'd like to see maybe a little Inferno train, like a little set running in the background, like in the shop.
Yeah, that's a cute idea. Certainly, having a train set in a train set in a toy shop could make a lot of sense. Okay. So I don't know. Is everybody okay with recording what we know so far and the pictures that we have so far, and putting all that stuff on a page, and then maybe we come back to this a little bit, after we've moved forward in the story somewhat.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I think we got over the big issue.
Right. My concern is that we've gone round on this topic quite a lot. It's sort of I guess you could say we've beat the horse to death, but in this case we've run the man over with the train quite a few times. So I think it's this kind of thing where normally I would say, all right, we've got a bit of work done, we've got some sketches done, let's step away from it. It'll be something that we continue to work on subconsciously, and then we can come back to, and perhaps when we come back to it, there'll be a better formed thought that kind of encapsulates work that we're going to do in the coming weeks. Right, so I'm just going to read through a few more of the comments. I think Greg's comment that, this was already read. I feel like Bumby in this game is 15 minutes a shopkeeper, and he should be off-puttingly creepy. I don't know how many minutes we're going to be in this shop. I mean, that's another question. Is the shop something we're going to return to? And that still needs to be defined. It could, I think, be someplace that we end up going back to quite often. Nabby says he looks good in the spider hole. I'll take that. Just no more pictures of real spider holes like you sent in the email. Okay. That spider hole is pretty creepy. The only thing that Alice saw of him the night of the fire was his shape and the glow of his glasses, says Seafoam. There's that, but then there's also the question of, are there other elements of him that Alice would have known from, say, his visiting the house? But, how much do you remember of being a 10-year-old child and seeing adults? I mean, most of the time you're just kind of looking at them at sort of knee height, right? So anyway, we can come back to this stuff later. We're getting a few pictures. the pictures of him with actual spider legs. People are saying, no spider, not that. And then, of course, there is the picture of him with the puppet hands, which is my favorite one of those. And Lucas says, I like how she has the Vorpal blade behind her back. Yeah, I like that too. And I think that's an important, a really key component to this is that I don't expect that she's going into this shop, um, sort of like a kid going into a candy store. She's going in there, as I think all of us would, with a bit of trepidation. And this is not a place that makes you feel safe and warm. I mean, this is a place that, especially once you interact with him, you're going to feel creeped out. You're going to feel something's not right. Alrighty, so let's see if there's any other comments here. Bumby is evolving into the toy maker, says Magus. Alice on Elm Street says, what if instead of showing Bumby at all, a puppet running the shop and we can't see who's controlling it? Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the kind of idea that's on display here right now. Bumby back in the shadows or perhaps hidden completely. I mean, it may be, and again, I stress when we start to build the level, it may be that the first time you go into the shop, you don't see Bumby, you only see the hands. And, when we start to write the story for this, it could be that you hear the voice disconnected from anybody, and the hands are running around the shop taking care of stuff. And Alice, of course, can say, where are you? Why don't you show your face? Who are you? And, contained in the response, and this can happen and it can unfold over multiple visits to the shop. It could be that sort of establishes for us that, oh yeah, okay, this is Bumby. I mean, obviously we know this because we're writing it, but for the people who are playing the game, that's a gradual ramping up to the ultimate reveal of like the glasses glinting in the shadows.
And again, this might be people's first Alice game too. So I think people here all know who Bumby is, but your average game player who doesn't have the history might not know who he is. So that's the other thing.
And it's also the case that people who did play Alice Madness Returns, by the time they play this, it could take quite a lot to jog their memory. The hands may not be enough. I mean, you and I, we sitting here, sort of brainstorming this, we're forgetting that those cues, if they're subtle, may not trigger the immediate association. And it's also important to remember that those subtle cues, when they do trigger the association, it's like an endorphin rush for the audience. It's that sudden realization makes your audience feel smart. And so, having a slight build up to that, that again, it's not going to work on us because we're sitting here brainstorming it, but for probably, 90% of even the people who've played the game, it is going to work. And it could even be that it works within the first 10 seconds of going into the shop. But it's like you walk into the shop, you're not sure what's going on in there. You hear a disconnected voice. You still haven't put together who that is. But hey, this is a toy shop. Your brain's already kind of tingling. The voice sounds kind of familiar. And then these puppet hands come out. And you may have a lot of people right then and there go like, this is the doll maker, this is Bumby, and they'll get that rush. But there may be people who still don't get it until like we ramp it up a little bit further. The second time you go in, now you get the glasses glinting in the shadows. Now they get it, right? So this is a gradual thing that we're going to ramp up to. We have a comment here from Octo Chicken. Greg says Bumby should be somewhat vague in imagery, figure his appearance later, perhaps depending on other story ideas that might influence his presentation. I think the main thing will be how he interacts verbally and physically with her, teaching her manners, how to be polite, creepily holding her hand too long, hand never opens. Some of that stuff works. Does he have hands? That I don't know, but I think that there are aspects of what's contained here that can work. Octo Chicken goes on to say, we don't want to get bogged down with a shopkeeper who will probably only talk to for 20 minutes over the course of the game's repeated trips, and who knows, when we get back in 5 months, maybe someone will have some amazing new ideas that'll click right into place. Yep. Well, to be honest, I already feel like we are a bit bogged down on this guy, so I am hoping that we can sort of cap that off today. Luca is doing the numbers thing again. So, Alice on Elm Street. I think having a puppet running the shop with Bumby's distorted voice would be a good middle ground for someone who has never played before. Yeah, I mean, all these ideas I think kind of go into the same general direction of we're not going to reveal right away that it's Bumby, but there'll be a gradual revealing of elements that for most players should eventually result in like, this is Bumby, right? So I think let's try to get that captured on the page and come back to it in a little while. Lucas says, I think the puppet hands work better because it plays into him being the doll maker. Later, I'm sure Bumby pulls his own strings. Is that a euphemism for something? Maybe he lies about being controlled by the Red Queen or something to get sympathy pity from Alice. Yeah. This sort of like playing himself off as a pity character. How did you end up like this where, we can't see your face? Maybe he's telling a story about how something's happened to him and he's trying to work at Alice's emotions. Exactly the kind of stuff we will work on when we start to get to his dialogue. So, Eva Marie says, I would like to see Bumby a little bit, though. Yeah, it's going to be a gradual reveal. So, Ancient Child says, tired brain just made a joke involving you're going to catch these hands and Bumby's puppetry hands. Okay. All right. Ancient Child, can we move on? Let's drain the Bumby swamp. Okay. Eva Marie says, will Alice be visiting Bumby every time she does weapon upgrades or during the circus realm? Eva Marie, I think that the current idea is that Bumby's shop exists in the train station. The train station is in Depression, and it serves as a central hub for the exploration of all the realms. And so we would be going back and forth between the train station in Depression quite often. And then when you go there, you would be able to take, like, let's say as an example, we haven't fully decided on this yet, but you're going to be collecting chaos coins from all around the realms. And, maybe when you're doing battle, there could be other sources for them, but it would be those chaos coins, which you could then take back to the shop and use to upgrade your dresses, your weapons, your items. So basically, that shop would be upgrade central, and you'd be able to go back there quite often. Yeah, Greg just says that, and Megas says the same. Okay. So I think that gets us pretty much to the end of, I hope, for now, the Bumby discussion, which would then take us to enemies. So for those of you following along over on YouTube, we are looking at the community ideas and the wiki in general at AmericanMcGee.com, and there are links to that in the description below. So if you go to the front page of the wiki, there's a section called Characters, and under Characters we have two subsections. One is called Protagonists, and the other is called Enemies. And so I actually want to start all the way at the top here with a question for us in terms of editing and layout of this information. Now we do obviously have characters in the game, but in terms of presenting them here in the wiki, there's a question about classification. Would we classify, for instance, the Queen of Hearts as a protagonist? Because that's the way she's currently portrayed. Is if you click on protagonists, you will see that there's another section called the Queen of Hearts. Now, the Queen of Hearts, in my mind, is very clearly an enemy, and she even is a boss character. So I could imagine her being in a couple of different places. And so that brings me to the question of, how do we break this up? Protagonists suggests to me sort of just central characters. Antagonists would, of course, be characters that are against us. And then enemies, which is what we have here. Let's get some feedback on how do we want to lay this out? Anybody have any thoughts?
You know, protagonists you can have as characters that are important and also major bosses. But enemies, I would see as just like cannon fodder you encounter along the way.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of the question of like NPCs. NPCs can be just non-player characters that you interact with, verbally, but there's also the idea of enemy NPCs, which are ones that would take up arms against you and fight you, right? So we need to figure out how we want to break this up. And the other thing to keep in mind is that we have the potential for NPCs who turn into enemy NPCs. And we also have the idea of, enemy NPCs that might turn into bosses. So it's a bit of a sticky question as to how to categorize the characters. Magus has written out here that there's protagonists, antagonists, enemies, and bosses. We could try that. I mean, that's a top level classification for them.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that characters can't fit into more than one category.
Yeah, so how would you do that? I mean, I'm assuming that there's a page called the Queen of Hearts, and when I go to look at bosses, I'll find her there, and when I go to look at antagonists, I'll find her there as well.
Correct.
Okay.
Because she has both those aspects. And protagonists, I mean, in writing, the protagonist is a character that, again, moves story forward. So the Cheshire Cat, the White Rabbit would be a protagonist. Antagonist is anyone against her. So most likely the Mad Hatter, even though we might have a friendly relationship, he's still against Alice. So.
Well, he would be against her if he ends up being against her, it would be as a boss. So I could imagine we'd find him under protagonists and boss, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so then why don't we agree on this? Under characters can be those four classifications that you've listed out. At least we'll start with those. So that'll give us 4 pages. And then maybe under those 4 pages, along with those lists, can be just a little quick paragraph that says, like, enemies. Here we will find characters who are exclusively about fighting. They fight against Alice. Under bosses, I guess it could be that, here we'll find characters that represent major battles for Alice. Okay, so once we've got those categories done, we could then dig into the list under protagonists is pretty good. I mean, there's quite a few entries there. And I still think, though, that, for instance, when you click on Alice, which she's the first one at the top of the page there, there's not really any detail on the page. So I think, one of the things we ought to think about is just detailing this out. Like, for instance, it could just say a simple thing like in this, in Alice Asylum, Alice is 13 years old. It could be some basic character information there about her. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, trying to work on Wiki.
Yeah, I was looking at that stuff too.
Okay. So then if we go to characters' enemies, I think as we discussed before the call, this section doesn't have any there's no real kind of breakdown per enemy. There's some odd sections. I mean, there's a section called Regarding Tentacles, which I love tentacles, so I think it's nice to have a whole section dedicated to tentacles, but I don't know that tentacles are or that subject really makes sense under the concept of enemies.
Who wrote that?
So yeah, this this needs to be broken up, and we can see that there's a ton of concept art under here. One of the bits just randomly selected here is called Crawley, and he is a mini boss constructed out of doll parts. And so I think what we'd like is that Crawley get a page dedicated to him, and that on Crawley's page again would be stuff like the placeholders for the kinds of things you'd normally find about enemy NPCs. That would be, health and weight and any kind of special moves, or if he, has any kind of special features, ability to break apart into multiple pieces and attack Alice, stuff like that. So this section, though, enemies, I think, could be expanded out quite a lot based on just breaking up into separate pages based on all the artwork that we've got. So before we move on, that's sort of just housekeeping for the characters section and for the enemies section specifically. Does anybody have any comments or concerns about sort of how we would break that up or what we're going to do with that? Just looking at comments as well. So Ancient Child says, can there be a subsection of NPCs? I'm not sure I quite understand that question. So if you want to detail that out a little bit, that would be good. Says like NPC tab and then neutral/enemy. Yeah, I think Ancient Child, any kind of concepts for classification system are welcome. Maybe something to talk with Magus and Asteria Visual about, since they're the ones sort of on top of wiki editing and layout.
I think
Luca,
she...
yeah.
No,
ahead.
sorry. I just realized you said what I was going to say. How there are going to be just different sections for each sort of character, what they are. And yeah.
Right.
I mean, I'm just looking at it from a story perspective of the antagonist, protagonist, and the protagonist could be an NPC. You might not be controlling the character, but you're still interacting with them and they have an important part of it. An
Right.
antagonist could also be an NPC. They're an important part of the story, but they're against the protagonist. That's really what they are. It's a big bucket.
It
You can
is.
fit most everything under one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I'd ask that we try to keep in mind the goals for the document. One is we want to end up with a design Bible, and the design Bible is something that the team would use, but keeping in mind that the team has a kind of self-driven interest in reading and deciphering and interpreting and then making a game out of the information presented here. One of the other goals is to just make something that looks cool and is really easily readable to someone who, say, might come along and want to help finance the production of the game. So in another sense, this wiki is a marketing tool, and for that goal. And as a marketing tool, we want it to be very easily navigable, like, be able to go around and find stuff really easily, and also that it just comes off as feeling interesting and polished, and there's not a lot of sort of dead ends or places where you just get stuck or find pages that don't feel finished, right? So going through some more of the questions here, Lucas says, oops, I think I scrolled past Luca's comment, or it vanished. Okay. Eva says, I think it'd be best to go to Bumby for the weapons upgrades, but if American decides not to give us infinite ammo at this time, okay, don't think I really understand that comment. Octo Chicken says, yeah, why is that regarding there? It was a comment I left on Shadow Alice's page. I mean, I'm glad that the best wiki subheading ever is there, but wow. Yeah, well, I think enemies section needs some cleanup, Greg. That's why we're here today. Okay, so Octo Chicken says, consider checking the Dark Souls or the God of War fan wikis to see how they break out enemies versus allies versus other styles. That's a great idea. Never be afraid to borrow from people who've gone before, because There is no such thing as inventing a new wheel. So we're not trying to make something new here. We're just trying to make something good. And that means sometimes borrowing from other people. Alice on Elm Street says, I am so confused. Yes, the comments flowing through the Discord right now are discordious. They're a bit confusing. I don't understand what's going on either. So it makes it difficult to kind of parse the thread of our narrative. Now we're talking about calamari. Okay. Eva Marie says, I simply replied to Luca's idea of going to seas for ammo. I mentioned it earlier. Okay. Well, none of that makes any sense to me, but that's fine. So I'm going to now go over to community ideas, and we're going to start at the top here with enemies. So if you go to community ideas suggestions, there's a section called enemies. And this is where our insane children have shared a lot of different ideas for enemies. And a lot of these I'm just going to say yes, and let's put this on the page that goes with that enemy. So at the top of the list, someone has suggested that Cranky the Bear explodes in a suicide bomber manner. And I like that idea. And what I would suggest is that we put that onto Cranky the Bear's page, which needs to get built, which is what we were talking about just a moment ago. Set up his page and have him appear. And if you haven't seen Cranky the Bear, he is there's an image of him over on the enemy's page, and it's one where Joey did up like pa, po, pow kind of sound effects written out, but he's a bear with a doll grafted onto him. And we all love Cranky. Here, I'll paste him into the chat here. So let's do build a section about Cranky and have his picture there, have his health there, have all these kinds of things there. So someone next comment is Cranky pulls itself apart to become separate enemies. Now, this comment, it goes to the heart of one of the things we've talked about in the past with regards to the doll enemies. And that is that you could be going through a section of the game where there's a bunch of doll parts laying about on the ground, and that they will animate and move towards each other, and they'll try to assemble into something that can fight Alice. And I think that this needs to be a section unto itself that basically talks about how the doll part enemies function in pulling themselves together, in fighting, in being knocked apart. And perhaps we need to think up some way in which Alice, knocks them apart to the point where they completely fall down and stay down. But this idea about Cranky pulling himself apart, I think that's a good one. And it could be one where, maybe he's like the bear part has taken enough damage that the doll part separates and continues to fight. And then we also, see other enemies, like there's a centipede enemy. You can imagine that thing might split itself in half in order to do maneuvers where, it kind of flanks Alice during battle. So for sure, when it comes to these doll part enemies, we should think about how do they pull themselves together? How do they fight? And does the fighting involve, choosing to split themselves into pieces or chucking their own heads at Alice or things like that? And then how do they die? So that would be a good section of things to kind of think about and cover.
Yeah, I like the splitting apart of Cranky a bit more than the exploding Cranky. It just seems to make more sense, and I can actually see it in game, like the point number 3 when it gets to half health. It kind of rips itself apart, and now you've got 2 separate doddering enemies coming at you. I think that just feels better to me than an exploding bear.
Yes.
So I think, we ought to put some thought into this. Like maybe the way this works is that doll parts, the parts themselves have separate health counters. And so long as a part has sufficient health, it will continue trying to attract itself to other doll parts. And, they should have some sort of a self-assembling goal. And once enough of them have assembled, they should try to move and they should try to attack Alice. And sometimes the results may be kind of like the Black Knight and Monty Python. Sort of legs and arms are off, but it's still trying to hop towards Alice, and do some damage, which in that instance would just make us laugh. But I think coming up with the system, the rules for that, I think would be a good idea. And I think there's a lot in that, in terms of just how the enemies, what their strategy is for battle. Greg has posted the Black Knight here. I mean, there's plenty of opportunity for comedy in that. So something to look at. Okay, so Alice on Elm Street says, in Borderlands 2, you can hinder the robots by shooting off their arms and legs individually, so maybe something like that. Yeah, it's a good idea. That plus, can they reassemble once bits have been shot off? So something to think about. Okay. Point 3, someone has written at half health. Cranky rips itself in half to become 2 enemies, the bear and the doll. And Cranky releases a feral scream as it's torn apart and attacks. Yeah, makes sense. This kind of detail is great. Again, build a page for Cranky, put this information on that page. Point 4, someone has written, Alice must fight the other inmates in the circus. And that some of the circus could include a strong man that has a barbell, can throw kettlebells, and is able to pound the ground and knock Alice over. He would move slowly but is extremely powerful. A Siamese twin enemy that can separate and grab Alice, squeezing her like an Iron Maiden. Slapstick clowns that spray acting from their pocket flowers instead of water. I think that maybe they mean acid, not acting. And a Grand Marshal enemy that can raid other enemies towards Alice and has a loud whistle that can do damage if Alice is within range. This is, I think, a bigger topic that we need to come back to, and we're going to need to do some thinking on, because my concern about the circus realm is that as currently imagined, we don't have enough by way of enemies there. There's not like a sort of a common enemy. As it's currently presented, I think we've imagined that Alice spends a lot of her time sort of sneaking around that domain. And I'm a little bit worried that that's going to become boring very fast. So I think for the circus realm stuff, perhaps what we should do is sort of pencil in that this is something we need to revisit relatively soon. Curious if we have any comments on that. Throw in. No. Okay. Point 6, someone has said broken toys do not attack until they've crawled to another broken toy and merged. Again, this is another point I think would be good to put into the page that describes the rules system for how the toy parts behave. There will be someone that has to sit down, a programmer that sits down with an animator and a 3D artist, and they come up with the system whereby the toy parts connect to one another, and then how they move and these kinds of things. And so my understanding, this is probably going to be some kind of machine learning toy box that has to be built first, that simulates all of the permutations of the ways in which these things could connect, and then weights the success of them, and then all that math is baked in, and then that is called upon inside the game to determine whether or not there are viable combinations that exist within wherever Alice happens to be, or whatever is resulting from the battle that she's currently in. That's my sense of it. So yeah, I think maybe some notes with regards to that on a page like that would be good. Alice on Elm Street says, maybe the pieces by themselves are like Slytherin rune and the parts together are more like the normal rune. Could be. Point 7, someone says, fight normal toys and enemies create another enemy. Yep. Again, another point that would make sense for the sort of like broken toy enemy behavior page. Point eight, someone says creatures that hide under the grass must watch for mounds they're hidden under. Um, yeah, this is a kind of classic Nintendo enemy tell design. I don't know yet if we have underground enemies defined yet, but this could be a feature for one of them. Octo Chicken says, I can't wait till this new logic program runs for the first time, but of course all the issues aren't ironed out, and all the doll bits just race over to try to merge with Alice until the alpha build crashes. Yeah, actually, during our last Pirate Jam, one of the programs that got built used machine learning to try to power these little wrestling. Um, I don't know what you'd call them. They were kind of like wrestling meat bags. And they were very floppy humanoid characters, but all of their animation and all their fighting and movement was all based off of machine learning. So these were essentially in-game characters who had to teach themselves how to walk and how to stand up and how to fight, and so they were really terrible at it. And the result was actually really interesting and also quite humorous. And so I think to take that idea and to push it further, if you go watch that, you'll kind of get a sense of what machine learning looks like when it's translated to characters trying to walk. And then if you can imagine that you give the machine the sandbox in which to try to figure out how all these pieces could work together, then you'll get some sense of what the result might look like, which could be quite interesting.
There's a YouTube channel called Code Bullet that does a lot of stuff with AI, and some of those learning videos are quite hilarious.
Yeah.
But also quite ingenious, the way that these structures think is the best way to move.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
it could either be really hard or just really stupid, but interesting either way.
Yep. Well, and I think actually that would make these enemies in Asylum stand out. That could actually end up being something where they really behave and look like and interact with the character in a way that's unique to this game. Unless, of course, someone else comes out with a similar concept in a game before we manage to get released, which, who knows, depending on how long EA is going to take. So yeah, that's going to be kind of interesting to see how we could apply that to the enemies. Okay. Couple more points here before we start to wrap up, and we are going to wrap up soon, so if you have any last minute comments or suggestions you want to throw in, now would be the time. So we've got here someone at point 9 has written lion unicorn chimera, and there's not a lot of detail to that. Perhaps somebody wants to explain that a bit. I mean, that could be one of those things where we get the artist to do a render of that if it's important. So do add a little more comment to that, and we'll see if there's something we can do there. Point 10, someone has said shadow versions of Alice's family. Yeah, this is a good point. I think that without a doubt, Alice is going to be suffering severe PTSD with regards to the sounds and sights from the night of the fire. And so it could be that many things inside of the game can trigger a kind of PTSD reaction. It could be hallucinatory, like illusions of her family placed on top of the monsters that she's fighting against. And so that's something I would want to put to the visual effects team to ask them to think about, how to properly represent the shattered mind state of a person who's suffering the effects of that recent trauma. And it could be that every enemy in the game and sort of every difficult interaction in the game that Alice has is likely to trigger something where a shadow version of her family is overlaid on whatever is going on. Right. So that brings us to the 10th point of the enemy's suggestions, and it also brings us to the end of this hour for the crowd design session. I'm just going to look through here at your comments. And so we've got Ancient Child saying, give me underground enemies. And be curious if we have thoughts on existing characters from the Wonderland books that would make for good underground enemies. Luca says self-harming inmates equals dolls, and suicidal inmates equals the trapeze act. Okay. Ancient Child is saying that underground attacks are better than air attacks. That I would agree with 100%. And Alice on Elm Street says the pieces being like slithering ruin in the sense that they can be dealt with quickly and do little damage on their own. And the pieces together are like normal ruin in the sense that they do more damage and take more effort to defeat. Yeah, that makes sense. And again, that's something I think to outline in the page where we talk about the system of the doll parts working together. And what you've just said there makes a lot of sense. It's simply that, a doll arm on its own may require just one shot to knock the energy out of it so that it cannot reanimate. But, multiple doll parts together, their strength comes, what's the old phrase? It's sort of like a stick on its own is easy to break, but a bundle of sticks something like that. So same concept would be contained there. We're getting a bunch of comments of things equaling. So medicated inmates equals candy addicts, and pyros equals fire breathers. I'm not sure what this is all about, but if you think that there's some brainstorming of interesting things going on there, maybe this would be something to record in the suggestions here for next time. We're now talking about bacon people from Octo Chicken, and yeah, I'm very confused.
It really derailed.
Yeah. Does anybody have anything else they want to add before we wrap up?
I think we just what everyone's been talking about is going over the enemies in the circus realm. I think that's a thing we should look at for another time.
Okay. Yeah, it's not just the enemies there. For me, it's some really basic questions. What weapons do we put in Alice's hands? Again, I had thought at some point that, in denial, she sort of didn't fight. But I'm a little bit concerned about that being boring. And so I'm sort of wondering now, is there a way for us to put some weapons in her hands? And then if the answer is yes, then how does the interaction of the weapons work with the NPCs? At what point can she, start shooting at them? At what point do they start shooting at her? And look, everybody may say, hey, we're perfectly happy to walk around without shooting for the first hour of the game. If that's the case, that's the case. But I do want to talk about it, though. Okay. So Lucas says, I remember one enemy with doll arm guards kept killing me. It took me forever to figure out I was supposed to use the parasail to shoot the shots back at it and break its guard. Yep. Some of the mechanics for fighting those dolls in Madness Returns were not always very obvious. An Ancient Child shares a comment that seems to get a lot of positive feedback, that is, knock the energy out of these doll parts, and we can visually see that happen. Yep, you can. All right. Well, that was yet another crowd design number 19. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So lots of stuff to think about in terms of denial and enemies that, how we're going to present them there. And then also lots of things to look at on the wiki for organization and layout. And then we can come back in 2 weeks and do another session and pick up where we left off. Anybody got any last comments they want to share?
you might want to let people know we're rolling it back an hour away from American Standard Time.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, this session did start at 10 a.m. my time in Hong Kong time, which I think was 7 p.m. For people PST or 10 p.m. for EST.
Correct.
So I think the next time we do a session, it's going to be 8 a.m. my time, which will be an hour earlier. So if it's been difficult for you to catch these live, then fear not, we will do the next one live an hour earlier. I think on that one, I will be coming to you from Thailand. So I hope I'm not in the middle of flying or something at that point. But anyway, we'll figure that out. That's still 2 weeks away. And for those of you who've been following along on YouTube, just a friendly reminder that what you're listening to is not live. This was pre-recorded. So if you've been live typing your feedback in the comments below, then maybe you want to delete those for fear of being embarrassed to death. I'm talking to you, Hamish. And so, yeah, there are links to the wiki in the description below, as well as links to our Patreon. If you want to join us live on our Discord server, then do please consider becoming a patron. It is the support of our patrons that makes possible all of the creativity that is flowing out of this project. So, yeah, links to Patreon in the description below. I think it's $5 a month, gets you access to the super secret Discord server, and
That's right.
all kinds of other goodies as well.
Yep.
All right, guys, that is it for today. So we will join you again in 2 weeks from Shanghai. I guess I'll say jib it up.
And get bent.
Get bent.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Jib it up and get bent. Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.